Arthur Brown, known simply as Grandpa Arthur to the few neighbors who still recognize him, wakes up every morning to the rhythmic ticking of his old alarm clock in his modest, weathered home on the edge of a small, snow-covered town. The house creaks with the weight of years, its silence magnified in the early hours as the sun struggles to pierce through thick gray clouds. Arthur's first task each day is to shuffle into the kitchen, his slippers scuffing against the hardwood floor, to prepare a single cup of coffee in his ancient percolator. The smell of the brew fills the air, a small comfort in a house long devoid of warmth. 5 years have passed since his wife, Margaret, passed away, and the once bustling home has grown eerily quiet. The cheerful clatter of her baking tools, the sound of her humming Christmas carols in late November, and the scent of her freshly baked gingerbread cookies are now memories that Arthur clings to but finds increasingly painful to recall. The house feels vast, almost cavernous, without her, and every corner reminds him of moments they once shared. His children, though they still love him, have busy lives in far-off cities. Their holiday visits have dwindled to the occasional phone call, always hurried and full of apologies about work, school, or winter storms that make traveling difficult. Arthur's days are a monotonous cycle of tasks designed to fill the time and distract from the aching loneliness. After finishing his coffee, he sits by the window with his faded morning newspaper, glancing more often at the street below than the pages in his hands. Outside, life goes on without him. Children laugh and throw snowballs, neighbors carry shopping bags full of gifts, and families decorate their houses with twinkling lights. Arthur's own home, once adorned with Margaret's elaborate Christmas displays, now stands dark and unadorned, its windows frosted with cold and its roof bare of the cheerful wreaths and lights that once brightened the neighborhood. When he ventures outside, his interactions with the world are brief and impersonal. The grocery store clerk offers a polite smile but doesn't linger. The mailman leaves packages on the porch without a knock. Even at church, where Arthur once felt a deep sense of community, the faces have grown unfamiliar, and he often sits in the back pew, unnoticed and unacknowledged. The one friend he could always count on, his old dog Rusty, passed away 2 winters ago, leaving Arthur with an emptier house and a heavier heart. As December begins, the cheerful holiday spirit around him feels more like a cruel reminder of his solitude. The streets glow with strings of lights, shop windows display festive scenes, and carolers fill the air with joyous songs. But to Arthur, it all feels hollow, a show he's no longer part of. His small artificial Christmas tree sits in a corner of the living room, still boxed up from the year before, untouched and forgotten. Even the thought of decorating it feels futile. Nights are the hardest for Arthur. The long, dark hours stretch endlessly as he sits in his favorite armchair by the fireplace, staring at the flickering flames. He tries to read, but the words blur together, and his thoughts drift back to the days when the house was filled with laughter and life. Sometimes he turns on the television, hoping to drown out the quiet with the sounds of holiday specials, but the cheerful faces and happy endings only deepen his sadness. Sleep comes late and is often restless, filled with dreams of Margaret's smile and the echoes of a life he once knew. As Christmas approaches, Arthur resigns himself to another year of solitude. He tells himself he's used to it now, that the pain is manageable, but deep down, he feels the growing weight of emptiness pressing on his chest. He doesn't expect anything to change. Christmas, like every other day, will pass in silence. What Arthur doesn't realize is that this year will bring an unexpected visitor and a chance at joy he thought was long gone. It was a cold, overcast morning when Arthur decided to venture into town to pick up a few essentials from the grocery store. The weather forecast had predicted snow later in the day, so he bundled himself in his thick, threadbare coat and pulled on his woolen hat. His cane tapped against the icy sidewalk as he walked slowly, the cold biting at his cheeks. Arthur rarely ventured far from home anymore, but the empty fridge and his dwindling supply of tea left him no choice. As he passed decorated storefronts and families bustling about their holiday errands, he kept his eyes down, avoiding the cheerful scenes that only magnified his loneliness. Reaching the store, Arthur grabbed a small basket, intending to pick up just a few items: bread, milk, and his usual tin of soup. The store was busy, filled with people chatting excitedly about their holiday plans, children tugging at their parents' coats to look at candy displays, and festive music playing over the speakers. Arthur moved through the aisles methodically, his head down as he avoided the festive chatter. In the canned goods section, as he reached for a tin of chicken noodle soup, his hand brushed against someone else's. Startled, Arthur looked up to see a small girl with bright, curious eyes and a red knit hat that seemed far too large for her head. "Sorry, mister," the girl said, her voice light and cheerful. She stepped back, clutching a similar can of soup. Arthur gave a small, awkward smile and mumbled, "No harm done." He expected her to run off to her parents, but instead she stayed, looking at him with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "Are you all alone?" she asked bluntly, tilting her head as if trying to understand why an old man would be shopping by himself. Arthur hesitated, unsure how to respond. Before he could say anything, a woman's voice called out, "Ellie." "There you are." A young woman, likely in her early 30s, approached, her arms laden with groceries. She gave Arthur an apologetic smile. "I'm so sorry if she bothered you," she said, reaching for the girl's hand. "She wasn't a bother," Arthur replied, his voice softer than usual. Ellie grinned up at him, her gap-toothed smile infectious. "He's nice, Mom," she declared, holding tightly to her can of soup. Arthur couldn't help but chuckle quietly at her confidence. The woman introduced herself as Sarah, explaining that she and Ellie had just moved to town to be closer to her parents. "Ellie likes to make new friends everywhere she goes," Sarah said, shaking her head with a fond smile. Arthur nodded politely, feeling a pang of envy at the easy bond between mother and daughter. Ellie, meanwhile, continued to chatter, telling him about how she was excited for Christmas and how she loved decorating cookies. Before they left, Sarah surprised Arthur by handing him a small candy cane from her bag. "Merry Christmas," she said warmly, her eyes meeting his with genuine kindness. Arthur accepted it hesitantly, unsure how to respond. Ellie waved enthusiastically as they walked away, her cheerful voice echoing down the aisle. "Bye, Grandpa." For the rest of his shopping trip, Arthur found himself oddly distracted. The encounter, though brief, had left a strange warmth in his chest. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, a fleeting sense of connection, however small. He clutched the candy cane in his gloved hand as he walked back home, replaying the interaction in his mind. The little girl's exuberance and her mother's kindness stayed with him, a flicker of light in the otherwise grey monotony of his day. That night, Arthur sat in his armchair, staring at the candy cane now resting on the table beside him. It seemed such a small gesture, but it carried a weight he couldn't explain. For the first time in years, he felt the faintest twinge of anticipation, not for Christmas itself, but for the possibility that tomorrow might bring something more than the usual solitude. Perhaps, he thought, life wasn't entirely done with him yet. Arthur didn't expect to see Ellie and Sarah again. Their brief encounter had been a pleasant but fleeting moment, something he assumed would fade into the background of his otherwise solitary existence. Yet, as the days passed, he found himself thinking about them more often than he liked to admit. He even placed the candy cane they'd given him on his windowsill, where it caught the soft light of the afternoon sun, a small but constant reminder of their kindness. 3 days later, as Arthur was shoveling snow from his walkway, a chore that seemed to take longer with each passing year, a familiar voice called out to him, "Hey, Grandpa!" Turning, Arthur saw Ellie running toward him, bundled up in a bright red coat that matched her hat. Behind her, Sarah walked briskly, carrying a tray covered with aluminum foil. Arthur straightened, leaning on his shovel, unsure whether to feel surprised or delighted. Ellie skidded to a stop in front of him, Her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Mom said we should bring you cookies," she announced, her voice full of excitement. Sarah arrived a moment later, smiling apologetically. "I hope we're not intruding," she said, holding out the tray. "Ellie insisted we come over. She's been talking about you non-stop since we met at the store." Arthur hesitated, his first instinct to refuse. He wasn't used to visitors or gestures of kindness, and part of him feared that accepting would somehow make him vulnerable. But Ellie's wide-eyed enthusiasm and Sarah's genuine smile left him with little choice. "You're not intruding," he said finally, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Come inside. It's too cold to be standing out here." Inside, Arthur felt a mix of nerves and embarrassment as he led them to his small, tidy living room. It wasn't much, and he worried they'd notice the dust on the shelves or the faded upholstery of the armchair. But Ellie didn't seem to care about any of that. She darted straight to the undecorated Christmas tree in the corner, her eyes lighting up. "Why doesn't it have ornaments?" she asked, turning to Arthur with a puzzled expression. Arthur hesitated, unsure how to explain. "I don't really bother with decorating anymore," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Ellie's face fell, and for a moment, Arthur thought she might cry. But then her expression brightened with determination. "We'll help you decorate it," she declared, turning to Sarah for confirmation. Sarah smiled gently. "Only if Mr. Brown wants us to," she said, her tone soft but encouraging. Arthur looked between the two of them, feeling a lump rise in his throat. It had been so long since anyone had offered to help him with anything, let alone something as personal as decorating a Christmas tree. "I suppose I could dig out the ornaments," he said finally, trying to sound indifferent but failing to hide the faint smile tugging at his lips. For the next hour, the house buzzed with activity. Ellie climbed on a stool to reach the higher branches, carefully placing ornaments Arthur hadn't touched in years, ones that Margaret had lovingly collected. Sarah strung the lights, her movements graceful and efficient, while Arthur supervised from his armchair, occasionally offering suggestions or anecdotes about the ornaments. The room began to glow with a warmth that had been missing for far too long, the tree's twinkling lights casting soft patterns on the walls. Ellie's chatter filled the house as she told Arthur all about her favorite Christmas traditions, from building snowmen to watching holiday movies. Sarah joined in occasionally, sharing stories about their life before moving to town. Arthur found himself laughing, a deep, genuine laugh that surprised even him. For the first time in years, his home felt alive, the silence replaced with the sounds of companionship. When the tree was finally complete, Ellie clapped her hands in delight. "It's perfect," she declared, stepping back to admire their work. Arthur had to agree. The tree looked beautiful, a vibrant symbol of the season he had long since stopped celebrating. "It's been a long time since it looked this good," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Before they left, Sarah handed him a small tin of cookies, promising to return soon. "It's nice to have a neighbor like you," she said warmly. Arthur didn't know what to say, so he simply nodded, his chest tight with gratitude. As he watched them walk away, Ellie waving enthusiastically from the sidewalk, Arthur felt something stir inside him, a flicker of hope, faint but unmistakable. That night, as he sat by the fire, the room aglow with the light of the decorated tree, Arthur realized just how much he had missed having people around. For years, he had convinced himself that he didn't need anyone, that solitude was a natural part of growing older. But now, with the memory of Ellie's laughter and Sarah's kindness fresh in his mind, he wondered if it wasn't too late to let people back into his life. Over the next week, Arthur's once quiet house became a hub of unexpected activity. Ellie and Sarah began stopping by regularly, sometimes bringing baked goods, other times just to chat or sit by the fire. At first, Arthur felt out of his depth, unsure how to adjust to their sudden presence in his life. He had grown so accustomed to silence and solitude that their laughter and easy conversation seemed almost surreal. But as the days went on, he found himself looking forward to their visits, the anticipation giving his mornings a newfound purpose. Ellie was a bundle of energy, always finding ways to fill the space with joy. One afternoon, she insisted on building a snowman in Arthur's front yard. Bundled up in his heavy coat, Arthur stood on the porch, watching as Ellie sculpted the snow with surprising precision. "You have to help, Grandpa," she called out, her voice brimming with determination. Arthur hesitated, his stiff joints protesting at the thought of bending and lifting in the cold. But Ellie's enthusiasm was infectious, and before he knew it, he was rolling snowballs alongside her, laughing at her exaggerated instructions about where to place the arms and nose. By the time they finished, a rotund snowman stood proudly in the yard, complete with a scarf that Ellie had borrowed from Arthur's closet. "He needs a name," she declared, her hands on her hips as she surveyed their work. "How about Marvin?" Arthur suggested, surprising himself with the playful tone in his voice. Ellie giggled. "Marvin the Snowman it is," she announced, clapping her mittens together. Sarah, who had been watching from the porch with a thermos of hot cocoa, snapped a picture of the two of them standing beside their creation. Later, when she showed the photo to Arthur, he felt a pang of emotion he couldn't quite place. It had been years since he'd been part of something so simple, so joyful. Their visits weren't always about snowmen and cookies. Sarah often stayed for tea, her calm presence a soothing counterbalance to Ellie's exuberance. She asked Arthur about his life, genuinely interested in hearing his stories. At first, Arthur was reluctant to share, worried he might bore her with tales of the past. But Sarah listened intently, laughing at his anecdotes about Margaret's stubbornness in debates or nodding thoughtfully when he spoke about the challenges of raising children in a time when life was simpler but often harder. In return, Sarah opened up about her own struggles. She spoke of the difficulties of being a single mother, of the move to a new town, and of her hopes for a fresh start. Arthur found himself admiring her resilience and determination. There was a strength in her that reminded him of Margaret, and he felt a growing respect for the woman who had so unexpectedly become a part of his life. Ellie, meanwhile, had adopted Arthur as her honorary grandpa with a determination that left him no room for argument. She peppered him with questions about everything from his favorite Christmas carols to the types of toys he played with as a child. "Did you have TV when you were little?" she asked one day, her eyes wide with curiosity. Arthur chuckled, explaining how his family had listened to stories on the radio instead. Ellie's fascination with his answers made him feel, for the first time in years, that his memories mattered to someone other than himself. One afternoon, Ellie discovered the old photo albums Arthur kept tucked away in a cabinet. With her usual enthusiasm, she convinced him to sit with her and go through them. As they flipped through the pages, Arthur felt a mixture of joy and sadness. Seeing Margaret's face again, frozen in moments of happiness, brought a lump to his throat. But Ellie's wide-eyed wonder as she pointed out the fashions of the past, or asked about the people in the pictures, made the experience less painful. "You and Grandma were so cool," she declared at one point, making Arthur laugh through the tears that threatened to spill. Slowly but surely, Arthur's life began to change. The once silent house now echoed with laughter and conversation, and the days no longer stretched endlessly before him. He started waking up with a sense of purpose, looking forward to seeing Sarah and Ellie, even if it was just for a few minutes. The decorated Christmas tree, which had once felt like an empty gesture, now stood as a symbol of the connections he had rediscovered. Arthur even ventured into town more often, sometimes with Sarah and Ellie by his side. On one such trip, they visited the town's holiday market, where Ellie insisted on buying a small ornament for his tree, a tiny wooden snowman that reminded her of Marvin. The gesture, though simple, filled Arthur with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. By the time Christmas Eve arrived, Arthur realized he had begun to think of Sarah and Ellie as more than neighbors. They were his friends, his family in a way he hadn't expected. The ache of loneliness that had defined his life for so long was still there, but it had softened, replaced by a sense of belonging he thought he'd never feel again. As Christmas Eve dawned, the quiet anticipation in Arthur's home felt different this year. He awoke not to the usual dread of another solitary holiday, but with a faint spark of excitement. Sarah and Ellie had promised to visit, and although Arthur didn't know exactly what they had planned, the thought of their company was enough to make the day feel special. Arthur spent the morning tidying up the house, a task he hadn't bothered with in years. He dusted the mantel, arranged the cushions on the couch, and even polished a small table by the window where Margaret had once placed her cherished Christmas centerpiece. The house, which had long felt like a neglected relic of the past, began to take on a subtle warmth as if it were waking up alongside him. By mid-afternoon, there was a knock at the door, and Ellie burst in with her usual enthusiasm, carrying a bundle of wrapped gifts that nearly obscured her face. "Merry Christmas, Grandpa!" she shouted, her voice filling the house with energy. Behind her, Sarah followed, carrying a large, steaming casserole dish that filled the air with a rich aroma of roasted vegetables and spices. Arthur stood in the doorway, momentarily overwhelmed by the scene. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, his voice gruff but tinged with emotion. Sarah smiled warmly, setting the dish down on the kitchen counter. "Of course we did," she replied. "It's Christmas, and no one should spend it alone." Ellie immediately took charge of the living room, placing the gifts under the tree and arranging them with the precision of a seasoned decorator. "We even got Marvin a little scarf," she announced, pulling a tiny red ribbon from her pocket and dashing outside to tie it around the snowman's neck. Arthur couldn't help but chuckle as he watched her through the window, her small figure standing proudly next to their creation. As evening approached, the house transformed into a cozy haven. Sarah had brought a string of golden fairy lights, which she and Arthur draped over the fireplace mantel, while Ellie darted between them, offering unsolicited but enthusiastic advice. The smell of freshly baked cookies wafted through the air as Sarah's homemade treats warmed in the oven, and a soft melody of Christmas carols played from a radio that Arthur hadn't turned on in years. For dinner, they gathered around the small dining table, which Sarah had insisted on covering with a festive red tablecloth she'd brought from home. The casserole dish joined a spread of roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and cranberry sauce, all lovingly prepared by Sarah. Arthur was reluctant at first, embarrassed by the idea of someone else going to so much trouble for him. But as he sat at the table, with Ellie on one side and Sarah on the other, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the joy of sharing a meal with others. Conversation flowed easily, punctuated by Ellie's endless stream of questions and Sarah's gentle laughter. Arthur found himself talking more than he had in years, sharing stories of Christmases past, and laughing at Ellie's dramatic reactions to tales of his childhood mischief. "You climbed a tree to hang lights?" she exclaimed, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I can't even climb the monkey bars without falling." After dinner, they moved to the living room, where Ellie eagerly distributed the gifts. Arthur was stunned to find that both Sarah and Ellie had brought presents for him. From Ellie, he received a hand-painted mug with the words, "Best Grandpa," scrawled in wobbly letters. From Sarah, a soft woolen scarf in a deep navy blue. "I noticed your old one was looking a bit worn," she said with a smile. Arthur felt his throat tighten as he accepted the gifts, struggling to find the words to express his gratitude. "I didn't get you anything," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Ellie waved him off with a dramatic shrug. "You gave me Marvin the snowman," she declared, as if that settled the matter. As the evening wore on, they sat by the fire, sipping hot cocoa and watching the lights on the tree twinkle in the dim room. Ellie eventually fell asleep on the couch, her small hand clutching the mug she'd painted for Arthur. Sarah draped a blanket over her, then turned to Arthur with a soft smile. "She's taken quite a liking to you," Sarah said quietly. Arthur nodded, his gaze fixed on the sleeping child. "She reminds me of my granddaughter," he admitted, his voice tinged with a mix of sadness and warmth. "We used to have Christmases like this, back when Margaret was still with us." Sarah reached out, placing a hand on his. "You're not alone, Arthur," she said gently. "Not anymore." For the first time in years, Arthur felt the walls he'd built around himself begin to crumble. The warmth of the fire, the soft glow of the lights, and the simple presence of Sarah and Ellie filled the room with a sense of belonging he hadn't realized he still craved. As he sat there, watching the flames dance in the fireplace, Arthur realized that this Christmas, his house was no longer just a place. It was a home once more. The morning of Christmas Day arrived with a soft glow of sunlight filtering through Arthur's curtains. He awoke to an unfamiliar yet comforting sound, the hum of life downstairs. For a brief moment, he was disoriented, wondering if he had dreamed the events of the night before. But the sound of Ellie's laughter quickly dispelled any doubt. He sat up, his joints stiff but his heart light, and smiled at the realization that his house was no longer a quiet, empty shell. Arthur made his way downstairs, the scent of freshly brewed coffee guiding him to the kitchen. There, he found Sarah bustling around in one of Margaret's old aprons, which she must have found in a drawer. "Good morning, sleepyhead," she teased, pouring him a cup of coffee. Ellie sat at the table, her cheeks dusted with flour as she eagerly shaped cookie dough into uneven stars and snowmen. "We're making Christmas breakfast," she announced proudly, though the kitchen was already in cheerful chaos. Arthur chuckled, the sight warming him in a way he hadn't felt in years. "Looks like you're making a mess," he teased, earning a playful pout from Ellie. But as he sipped his coffee and watched them work, he felt a deep sense of contentment settle over him. The kitchen, once a quiet and functional space, was alive with laughter, chatter, and the clatter of utensils. After breakfast, an admittedly unconventional meal of scrambled eggs, toast, and slightly burnt cookies, they sat together by the tree to unwrap the last of the presents. Ellie, ever the generous spirit, had insisted on wrapping up some of her old toys to give to Arthur. "You need these," she explained solemnly as she handed him a box containing a slightly worn teddy bear and a set of plastic building blocks. "For when you get bored." Arthur laughed, his heart swelling at the gesture. "Thank you, Ellie," he said, his voice soft with emotion. "I'll treasure them." As the morning wore on, Arthur began to notice the subtle changes the past few weeks had brought to his home and, more importantly, to himself. The once dusty corners now gleamed with light, the air no longer carried the weight of silence, and even the decorations seemed to sparkle with newfound energy. But the greatest change was within Arthur himself. He felt lighter, as if a burden he hadn't fully acknowledged was beginning to lift. After lunch, Ellie proposed a walk to the town square to see the giant Christmas tree. "It's the biggest one ever," she exclaimed, tugging at Arthur's hand. Arthur hesitated, his old habit of avoiding the bustling town stirring within him. But Sarah's encouraging smile and Ellie's pleading eyes convinced him otherwise. Bundled in his new scarf from Sarah, Arthur found himself walking down the snowy streets with his newfound family. The town square was alive with music, laughter, and the bright glow of decorations. Children ran around playing tag, couples strolled hand in hand, and families gathered to take pictures by the enormous tree at the center of it all. Arthur hadn't been here in years, and the sight filled him with a mix of nostalgia and wonder. Ellie ran ahead to join a group of children building snow forts, leaving Arthur and Sarah standing together by the tree. "Thank you," Arthur said quietly, his voice almost lost in the din of the crowd. Sarah turned to him, her expression curious. "For what?" she asked. "For bringing life back into my home," Arthur replied, his gaze fixed on Ellie's joyful figure in the distance. "I didn't realize how much I needed it." Sarah smiled, placing a hand on his arm. "You've done the same for us," she said. "Ellie talks about you constantly, and I think I needed a friend just as much as you did." The sincerity in her voice struck a chord in Arthur. He had spent so long believing his life was on a steady decline toward solitude, never imagining that a chance encounter in a grocery store could change everything. But as he stood there, surrounded by the sounds and sights of Christmas, he realized how much had shifted. When they returned home that evening, the house felt warmer than ever. Ellie fell asleep on the couch again, clutching the teddy bear she had given Arthur earlier. Sarah and Arthur sat by the fire, sipping tea and talking about the future. For the first time in years, Arthur allowed himself to think about tomorrow with hope rather than dread. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Sarah stood to leave, carrying Ellie in her arms. "We'll see you tomorrow," she said, smiling softly. "Ellie's already planning our next adventure." Arthur walked them to the door, watching as they disappeared into the snowy night. When he returned to his armchair, he found himself smiling at the thought of the days ahead. The house was quiet once more, but it no longer felt empty. It felt alive, filled with the echoes of laughter, the scent of cookies, and the promise of companionship. For the first time in years, Arthur celebrated Christmas not as a lonely old man, but as a friend, a surrogate grandfather, and a part of something greater than himself. And as he sat by the fire, the decorated tree twinkling beside him, he realized that Margaret would have been proud of him for opening his heart again. This wasn't just a good Christmas. It was the beginning of a new chapter in Arthur's life, one filled with love, friendship, and the warmth of human connection. And for that, he was deeply, profoundly grateful.